In emergency management, the definition of a stakeholder is any person or entity with a vested interest in the survival or recovery of a given community.
This is the Stakeholder Prepping Podcast, where the tactical comes from the practical, and today, you become your own stakeholder.
Here are your hosts, Chris and AC.
Welcome back to Stakeholder Prepping, where you, yes, you are the stakeholder in your own survival. And AC, today we're stepping into a topic that gets people emotional pretty quickly. So, yeah, I'm just going to say it. It's martial law.
Yeah, we're going to talk about martial law. This actually wasn't on my radar at all, but this was a listener request, actually. Our friend BK, who runs a big international security company, he reached out and said, "Hey, you guys should tackle martial law." So this wasn't one that was really on my radar at all, but I understand why this probably does keep people up at night and why it's probably worth diving into a little bit. So, yeah, let's be upfront about this. This isn't about fear. This isn't going to be a fear episode.
No, we're going to try to make this one of the most grounded and fact-based conversations that we've done, because if you don't separate fact from fiction here, you either panic or you ignore it entirely. And with everything going on in today's geopolitical climate, it's starting to become more and more and more of a topic of conversation. So we're going to do our best here. We're not going to tackle everything, but this is kind of a precursor episode. So if you want more of this, you got to let us know.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And yeah, like you said, the panic or you just ignore it. And both of those things, I think, can definitely get people hurt. So probably the right thing to do is kind of somewhere in the middle, right?
I would agree. So let's define this properly. And let's start out with martial law is not a conspiracy term. It's used by conspiracy theorists all the time, but it is not a conspiracy term. It is a legal and historical reality. Okay. At its core, martial law is when military authority temporarily replaces or supplements civilian authority during a crisis.
Right. And I think the key word there is temporary, at least in theory. And if we look back historically at, when martial law has been declared, I think like a statewide martial law, I don't think that's happened since either World War II or maybe the 60s. Like it hasn't happened in forever. Like statewide martial law, not even in Katrina did we see statewide martial law declared. So this is a bit of a prepper boogeyman because it really hasn't happened in like 70 years or something.
Well, we've got some historical examples here, and we'll
Right.
definitely get to that. But you are, for the most part, right. In the United States, it is temporary. It's not unlimited power. It is constrained by the Constitution and the Ex parte Milligan decision. That ruling specifically said that martial law cannot exist where civilian courts are still operating.
Wow. So right there, that's kind of your first myth check. Martial law isn't supposed to just override everything indefinitely from civil law enforcement to the court system and all that kind of stuff. It's not designed to do that. That's not the point.
That's not the design of it. So we can look at actual historical examples of this. Let's anchor this in real history, because martial law isn't hypothetical. It has happened repeatedly. So these are just from the US, but we'll start in the Wayback Machine, as you like to call it, AC.
Okay.
Let's go back to 1861 to 1865, the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in certain areas. Over 13,000 civilians were detained without trial.
Yeah, that's crazy. And that's not theory. That's well documented. 13,000 people just detained. The president waved his magic wand and said, "We're suspending habeas corpus." And by the way, Lincoln was an attorney, right? So he knew the fallout from this. He knew what this would do.
And he knew what was in the Constitution. So he knew what was well within his right and where that legal line of what was constitutional and unconstitutional was. And he effectively used martial law to help quell certain portions of the Civil War to stem the spread of violence.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of the last, I mean, war on American soil. That was obviously the last time that we would have had martial law declared like that. But more recently than that, I think in the early 1900s, was it 1906, the San Francisco earthquake, and there was a fire and all that. They declared martial law then,
Right. There
right?
there was the 1906
It was '06,
earthquake.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, the San Francisco quake. Martial law
Right.
was declared. That only lasted, I think, 4 weeks, um, just as a state of crisis. There was
Right.
martial law declared in Alaska after a quake. Again, 3, 4 weeks state of crisis. Uh,
Right.
but in the 40s,
Right.
after the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
Yeah, that lasted nearly 3 years, which was crazy. Not only did martial law last for 3 years, um, and that was obviously right when we got into, uh, World War II, civilians were actually tried in military courts for 3 years, and there were curfews, and there was a lot of strict censorship enforced because they were worried that these, uh, civilians of Japanese descent were sending information back to Japan. So they totally squashed all this stuff. Obviously, they didn't have Facebook and Twitter and that kind of stuff back then, but they censored the populace. They wouldn't allow letters to leave and things like that because they didn't want information getting out from people they thought were sympathetic to the Japanese. And then obviously the Japanese internment, Japanese American internment, where I think 120,000 people were sort of imprisoned, right? And two
Yeah,
thirds of those people were U.S. citizens. I forget there's that island in San Francisco. Uh,
Mandanar?
no, it's not that one. I can't remember which one it is, but it's there's an exit there right off the 101 where they moved a bunch of people um to like an island. But yeah, dude, they in San Francisco, they basically, if you looked like you could be Japanese, yeah, they kind of scooped you up, and they did that via martial law.
Yep. Over
So
120,000 people of uh, Japanese American citizens and Japanese descent, they were interned. And then, like you said, Hurricane Katrina, it wasn't officially martial law, but it was martial law like conditions. There were 50,000 plus troops out of the National Guard that were deployed. There were curfews that were enforced.
right.
There were documented firearm confiscations that were later ruled unconstitutional. I remember I was in basic training when Katrina happened, and
Oh
a
yeah.
drill sergeant came in and stormed in and asked, "Does anyone have family in New Orleans?" And we were all
Really?
like, "Why?"
Yeah.
And he got up to the whiteboard and he took out a marker and he drew a picture of a levee and a levee on the other side and drew a little city in the middle and then took a blue marker and went shriek and said, "New Orleans is underwater."
Holy crap. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, I mean, obviously Katrina it wasn't martial law. It wasn't statewide martial law, but you're right. It really was National Guard authority. They rolled in 50,000 troops, and I've seen a number of interviews with that lieutenant general who was down there with it was what's his name, Russell Honore. Have you seen any of his
Yep.
interviews?
Yep.
I mean, the guy's famous. The guy, it was amazing. But they call him a Category 5 general, right? And he was, but there was some great scenes where you had all these people spilled out into the streets, and you had National Guard troops with their weapons drawn on these people that were just trying to get from the first place that somebody told them was safe to the next place that someone told them was safe. And there's a great scene of him, I want to say it was right outside that Harrah's Casino there in New Orleans, where he's screaming at all these troops to put their weapons down because these were just civilians, and you had all the National Guard troops. They had all these people at gunpoint.
Yeah, and if you want to look at more examples of where martial law in the United States was enacted, look at the LA race riots in the 90s, the Kent state riots in the 60s. You have several examples of it, even going back to the Trail of Tears with the Native American populations being relocated all the way from the Central Plains down into Tennessee and Oklahoma and onto the reservations and places like that. I will say that is one thing the United States government is very good at is martial law.
Yeah, and we look at that. You're right. Katrina wasn't actually martial law. It was pretty darn close. But yeah, martial law was not like you know, it was a state of emergency, but they didn't declare statewide national or martial law. I think the last time they did that statewide was like 63 in Maryland. And that was, yeah, part of the like race riots and stuff. Was the last time we truly had statewide martial law was in the 60s.
Yeah, and I think nationwide, the last time that we saw truly hardcore crackdown martial law was in East Germany, just before the wall came down during the Cold War.
And the biggest difference obviously is we have guns. I mean, that's the biggest thing about the US is why you don't get as much government overreach, because your people are just going to get crazy, and there's going to be a whole lot of firefights with National Guard troops and things like that. But you're right, like you said, we've had documented firearms confiscations, which were later ruled unconstitutional. But at the time, yeah, they just decided, you know what, there's too many people with guns here, and we're just going to go ahead and take those. And I could not imagine what that tension would be like.
And I have friends who responded to Katrina that said they received more gunfire responding to Katrina than they did in Afghanistan and or Iraq combined.
That's just so crazy. And yeah, I mean, there's video footage of people standing on their roofs shooting at Coast Guard and National Guard helicopters coming to save people.
Which is absolutely wild. But I think the big takeaway is pretty simple here. Martial law doesn't always look like tanks and war zones. It is not always Tiananmen Square, right? Sometimes it can look like curfews or military presence. Sometimes it is restricted movement. Sometimes it is limited rights. Here, where I live in Tennessee, I have gone around shopping for gifts and things like that and seen the military patrols walking around, and it'll be 5 or 6 MPs walking through the mall or walking down the street or grouped up out of a gas station. And I know what they're there for. Leave them be. That's
Right.
my just be the gray man.
I can remember growing up in the Pacific Northwest, we didn't get really nasty snow events very often, but every once in a while we would get just really nasty winter snow events. And we're just not really made for that, like we don't salt the roads because the salt's bad for the salmon or whatever. But, yeah, it's just not, we're not really meant for that. And I remember this had to be mid 90s, and they deployed the National Guard just to drive the police around. And it was a very interesting, federal and local agency collaboration where the police just couldn't respond to calls anymore. And so the National Guard was just driving them around in Humvees, and they weren't involved in any of the law enforcement activities. They were simply chauffeurs for the police, but they were using Humvees to drive the cops around. So then if somebody got arrested, they just kind of had to sit in the back of a Humvee. Well, some guardsmen had to drive around. I thought that was crazy. And then I remember after September 11th, you would see lots of troops deployed in the airports. And it was interesting then because I noticed that you would have, yeah, like you said, 3 or 4 or 5 of them, but only one of them would actually have a magazine in their rifle. Do you remember seeing this where
I do.
there was like one responsible party or something, right? There was like one E4 that had the duty and is like, okay, you have all the magazines. So if shit gets real, you have to pass it out to your friends. Like wasn't everybody was armed. It was a very much a show of force, but zero use of force.
Exactly. And that's sometimes what martial law looks like as well.
Right.
But I really feel bad for the guys that got arrested and got thrown in the back of a Humvee because as soon as they hit 45 miles an hour, their brain turned into scrambled eggs.
Well, big bias ply tires. There's no way they were doing more than 15 miles an hour. I mean, think about it. Like if the snow was that bad and they were probably chaining them up too. I can imagine that just had to be crazy. But yeah, you just got to sit between some National Guard soldier and a cop on your way to jail in the back of a Humvee. I just thought it's crazy. I haven't seen that since.
I can just imagine going to the dentist on their next checkup. So why do you need 7 teeth replaced? I got arrested.
Yeah, I got arrested. Oh, so yeah, you were resisting arrest? Nope. Just drive. just
I got
right
thrown in
in
the
the
back
back-
of a Humvee.
right in the back of a Humvee with bias ply tires below freezing. Um, so let's break this down in let's break this down to reality. Okay, what actually changes when martial law hits?
Well, let's take this from kind of a data-driven approach. So across global case studies, the most consistent measures are curfews, which are used in over 80% of emergency and or military control scenarios globally. Hands down, curfews are a big measure. They are very common during riots, natural disasters, and insurgencies. And that does make sense when you think about it.
Oh, 100%, because nighttime equals that coordination window. Nighttime is when bad things happen, right? So it makes sense that that's when you're going to have that curfew. But there's some other stuff that happens too, right? Movement restrictions, I think, is the other thing we think of besides curfews. You have pretty serious movement restrictions. So we see things like checkpoints with ID checks. We have restricted zones. I know, think about during COVID lockdowns alone, over 4 billion people globally experienced movement restrictions. Think about how crazy that is that more than half the planet had some level of movement restriction just because of COVID.
And that's according to UN data. And that wasn't even martial law.
And
That was
that wasn't martial law. That's
that
exactly
was
right.
just public health policy,
Sure. Yeah,
right?
100%.
You had entire countries on lockdown. Look at Italy. During COVID, they locked down everybody unless you had a pre-approved government pass to go grocery shopping.
Yeah, that's wild. And I was just out here in the country, man, raw dog and fresh air.
It was kind of cool to see the dolphins come back into the channels of Venice, though,
I thought that was actually pretty cool. Yeah, right. Like you did see a little bit of the earth healing because people didn't drive so much. That was kind of cool.
right? Uh, the third thing that we normally see is military presence. So inside of the U.S., that is generally going to be the U.S. National Guard. And the reason that it is the National Guard and not active duty military troops is because of the Posse Comitatus Act. Active duty military and federalized troops, so reserves, cannot act without a local law enforcement agency present.
Right. They don't have that Title 14 jurisdiction like that the Coast Guard has, for example.
Exactly. And National Guard, Coast Guard, they do. But we have over 17,000 deployments domestically per year on average of the National Guard. That is including um, all of the Coast Guard rescue operations. That is including National Guard uh, relief operations and rescue operations and disaster recovery operations. That is including search and rescue. I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was the South Dakota National Guard was deployed and ran search and rescue ops, helo ops for something like 38 hours straight trying to find a lost 3-year-old girl, and they found her. Uh,
Crazy.
so yeah, there's over 17,000 deployments in the US every year. Now, the National Guard can be federalized under the Insurrection Act. That's why we had National Guard troops deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan during the global war on terror. They were federalized and then deployed as federal troops. But active duty troops cannot be deployed on American soil without a local government agency in charge.
Right, and I think that's the legal mechanism a lot of people just don't really understand, and that is a lot of that Title 14 jurisdiction. It's really interesting seeing how certain government administrations, apply that. For example, if you look at carrier battle groups all around the world right now, there's always a Coast Guard cutter deployed with those carrier battle groups because anything the Coast Guard does is not an act of war. They're like an international law enforcement organization. So they can do like vessel safety checks and things like that. So it is really interesting the legal mechanisms that we can use when we start talking about federal troops.
I never knew that.
Yeah,
That's
it's crazy. In fact, when we saw recently in the news those you know Marines rappelling out of helicopters and like taking Venezuelan oil tankers.
Mhm.
What they didn't really tell you is that a bunch of those guys were Coast Guard. The Marines were operating under Coast Guard Title 14 jurisdiction when that happened. And I've actually got a friend who's on an MSRT team, which is basically the Coast Guard's version of SWAT team. They're not like Navy SEALs, but they do some pretty badass stuff sometimes. And they had he had to go to Camp Pendleton to learn how to rappel out of a helicopter because the Coast Guard doesn't really do that very often, believe it or not. So they actually had to go work hand in hand with Marines because those weren't acts of war. Those were international maritime policing actions and vessel safety checks. And we did that under Title 14 jurisdiction. So the Marines were actually acting under the Coast Guard when we did that stuff. Isn't that crazy?
that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's funny, and I get involved in a lot of this in my daily job. I will give you one more example. There is one, so the Coast Guard, obviously, Coast Guard, they have that law enforcement jurisdiction in the United States. There is one Coast Guard unit. The Coast Guard calls them the Spec SVs, Special Purpose Craft Screening Vessels. The Navy calls them submarine escort vessels, and so there are these U.S. Navy owned vessels and they escort the submarines in their dive trenches. So our nuclear submarines, there's one in Bangor, Washington, and then there's one dive trench out of Kings Bay, Georgia. And these vessels are owned by the US Navy, but they say Coast Guard on the side, and they are crewed by Coast Guard because the Navy can't escort their own submarines out to the dive trench because they can't legally shoot at people. So, does that make sense?
It
So,
does.
yeah, so you have like these force protection vessels if a boomer sub is going out to a dive trench and somebody wants to approach that sub, the Navy can't legally shoot at them, but the Coast Guard can under Title 14. So these U.S. Navy vessels are crewed by Coast Guard. It's the only mission like that in the entire United States. And all these Coast Guard, all these guardsmen on these vessels report through a Navy O5. So they have to be U.S. Coast Guard. And it's what they call a single scope mission, which is really crazy. So this means that, like, if they're escorting these boomers out to the dive trench, these new Trident submarines, and if a boat drives up next to him and throws a baby in the water, the Coast Guard cannot do anything about it. They have a single scope mission, and that's to protect the submarines.
Interesting.
And it's Coast Guard because they need this jurisdiction that allows them to have arresting power in the United States. So anyway, there's your little fun Title 14 lesson.
Well, I'm already learning a lot. So yeah,
It's
military
amazing.
presence is number 3.
Yeah.
And then number 4 would be communication control. So we've gone over curfews, movement restrictions, military presence. Number 4 would be communication control, and that's limiting communications. This is where reality really matters, because a full communication shutdown is extremely unlikely in the US because over 90% of the infrastructure is privately owned. And the internet is decentralized. It's not impossible, but it is highly unlikely.
Okay, that makes sense. But we're talking about a localized disruption, like very possible, right?
Extremely possible. So you could take out cell towers. You could even take out cell towers nationwide, and we would still have at-home Wi-Fi to be able to communicate and even make calls through. It would
Of
strain
course.
the system, but it wouldn't completely decapitate it. If you could take out a central node, and that would wipe out a local area, but everyone else can still communicate. And then also you have ham radio that our ham radio champs out there, they can pass information, and that cannot really be cut off unless you somehow fill the entire sky with tinfoil strips.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so I see what you're saying. Yeah. So you can try to cut off some sort of localized communication shutdown if you wanted to, but it's not very practical, especially with things like Starlink that exist now. It would just be pretty hard to do things like that these days. It's not like in 1940s Hawaii where you just say, okay, you can't have newspapers anymore or something like that.
Right. And in other countries like North Korea, where their entire network is government owned, it's very easily shut down. And it is extremely easy to immediately cut off all communication. All they have to do is flip that big switch in the central house in Pyongyang.
Right. Yeah, 100%. So then the fifth thing is resource control, right? Rationing. This is something we saw a ton in World War II, is that rationing effect, right? Where things like fuel and food and even metals, right? We saw steel pennies in the 40s because the the copper was too valuable for the war effort. So that resource control and rationing is something that we can see out of martial law. The modern equivalent would likely involve supply chain prioritization and purchasing limits. We definitely see this with like War Powers Acts, where the government can go to a private business and say, yeah, you've got to fulfill our order first, even though our order came in last.
Yeah, and the Defense Production Act, you know, World War II, we saw fuel, food, rubber, silk. Um, Silk was rationed because we were making parachutes out of it for airborne troops, all kinds of things. But now the Defense Production Act, we've actually seen that put into place for things like baby formula, and it's still enacted for baby formula.
Right. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. That's crazy.
So let's address the one big one. And this is what doesn't typically happen.
Yeah. And this, I think, is where people go off the rails, because things that are very unlikely are the things that people definitely fear the most, especially when we start talking about martial law.
I agree. And Again, we're basing this on modern U.S. infrastructure and modern U.S. legal structure. So if you are in Australia, like our friend Glenn, all the way down there, I
All the
might,
way down under.
um, you have some different challenges to work through. But we are basing this on the modern U.S. legal and infrastructure. Nationwide indefinite martial law is extremely unlikely. Mass relocation without due process, that is going to be legally contested immediately and until it is blue in the gills. And then a total media blackout is nearly impossible. To do what Iran has done in the United States would take a monumental, earth shattering feat of engineering and technology, and our government infrastructure just does not have that in them to do it.
Yeah, that's right. It would be so nearly impossible for anything like that to happen because you're dealing with 50 states, 50 pretty independent states, and you have independent courts, and you have this massive infrastructure complexity. So, seeing something like a nationwide martial law, like we saw, like in that movie Civil War recently, it's just
Yes.
so unlikely to happen because we really are a nation of, 50 little tiny independent countries with a couple of laws that tie us all together. But I just can't see a scenario where you have a federal declaration and all 50 states just get on board. I just can't see that. And it's not particularly political. It's regardless of what political party is in power. You're just not going to see all 50 states go, "Yep, nationwide martial law. We'll buy into that." You didn't even see that with COVID. Not all 50 states had COVID restrictions. Some of them had zero COVID restrictions, even though it was federal mandate because they just said no because they're little tiny independent nations.
Yeah. If you take Wyoming, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota versus Florida, Virginia, Massachusetts, they're completely different ecosystems as far as their not only their political spectrum, but also their entire uh, logistical systems and how they operate. One of them is uh, very business centric. One of them is very agro-centric. One of them is swampland. One of them is mountains. There's so many things that make America very unique, and that's one of the reasons it's an extremely difficult territory to conquer as far as a land invasion. I mean, I would love to see a country get into the swamps of Florida and be like, "What the fuck is that?"
Can you can you imagine? Yeah, exactly. Let's go invade Louisiana. Nope. Nope. Not gonna happen.
Exactly.
Not gonna
But
happen.
but you've got all of these different independent uh, legal systems working, and they're just banded together by threads. And then somebody comes in and says, "All right, all of you must abide by this new nationwide order." You're gonna have enough pushback. It's not gonna happen overnight, and it's not gonna happen easily.
But let's
So
pretend it can. Let's pretend that somehow there's like some nationwide martial law, or wherever you are, there happens to be martial law declared. Let's talk about that. Like, how can we realistically prepare for that?
yeah, let's talk about what actually matters, which is the preparation. So you are not preparing for the apocalypse here. You're preparing for restricted movement, limited access, and increased scrutiny. So you need a supply buffer. Um, Again, we're going to go based off of the FEMA statistics. And the recommendation there is a 3-day minimum of all of your supplies, food and water. You need a 3-day minimum of food. You need a gallon per person per day of water, all of your supplies. But in reality, With martial law, we're aiming for 2 to 4 weeks. So we have to have that buffer built in.
Right, because those disruptions, they rarely resolve themselves quickly. And we've talked about this before that there's, the average grocery store has like 3 days worth of food on hand. So even if you have your 3 days worth of food and the grocery store doesn't get delivery for 3 days and then they start getting deliveries again, it's not like all the store shelves are going to be stocked overnight. So, yeah, even if it is a very short window when you are restricted and you need to be in charge of your own supply chain, it's a huge ramp up to get all of those supplies back on the shelves once they have been depleted. So that's why, yeah, really, you want to try to aim for that. You said 2 to 4 weeks. I always say the 3 weeks. Yeah, but that's really where you want to try to aim for with being in charge of your own supplies. You want to have 2 to 4 weeks worth of everything you need on the shelf at home.
Exactly. And then let's take a look at the second step for planning is mobility planning. The average American commute, and this is average when you take into account all of the work from home and all of the people that drive an hour and a half one way to get to work. I don't know how you do it, but props. The average American commute is around 41 miles per day round trip. Okay. Now take into account if there are fuel restrictions or checkpoints. Now there's a checkpoint on the highway that's going to take you an extra hour to get through because they have to scan everyone's vehicle. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's you need to have those alternate routes down. If you don't have those alternate routes, then you don't have mobility. And we did an entire episode on this. And I'm not saying like, oh, hey, there's a National Guard checkpoint checking IDs. I should pull off the road and climb into the sewer and have some mutant Ninja Turtles get me to work. I'm not saying that, but I am saying know those alternate routes, uh, know those other ways to get around, especially in your area of operations. I know where I am, there's one major highway that can basically get you to my home without going way out of the way, like dozens and dozens of miles out of the way. But there are some dirt roads up in the hills where your GPS doesn't work and they're not marked. So unless you know those alternate routes, you're just going to be stuck on the highway if there's a car accident, even. So knowing these alternate routes in your area of operations is just so imperative. And we did an entire episode on all those different alternate routes from hiking trails to sewers to the train tracks that cross over the river. And we got pretty down into the weeds on that one. But knowing your alternate routes, it's not that crazy, especially if there are going to be checkpoints. Maybe not necessarily because you don't want to get scrutinized, but because you just don't want to wait in line.
Yeah, you just want to make it to work on time and not have to spend an extra 2 hours a day in the car listening to us through your radio.
Right, exactly. Although, yeah, that would be a good way to pass the time if you're one of those people that has an hour or 2 hour commute, maybe 3 hours with martial law declared. Just download enough of our back library, and we'll keep you company.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, next up is information redundancy. And this is going to be your trusted sources. This is not, a backlog of Twitter. Uh, this is your NOAA weather radio and ham radio networks, if you can get a hold of them. Ham operators often provide the first confirmed ground truth during disasters, which
Yeah,
is
they
awesome.
love this. They love this shit, man. The ham radio operators, anytime anything goes wrong at all, they're the first ones. They want to deploy their little, the power on wheels and their deployable little antennas that crank up out of a generator and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they act absolutely live for this stuff. So you're right, and we see it all the time. Even when you just have like races. We have a couple of relay races that go uh, through the hills where there's limited communications, and the ham radio people come out just to volunteer to work those and get information from one side to the other because they just love that stuff. So you're exactly right. The ham radio operators kind of are the first ones on the ground to deploy their antennas and their generators and make sure that everybody has comms.
Yep. And lastly, gray man strategy. This is where survival becomes psychological. And this is important. You don't want to be a threat. You don't want to be a leader. You don't want to be a resource target. AC, what do we want to be?
You want to be forgettable.
Yep.
100%. You want to be Waldo. You want to be forgettable. You want to be gray. You want to be that gray man. And yeah, you just don't want to stick out. You don't want to give anybody a reason to scrutinize you. And I think you could come up with some very just pragmatic ways to do this. Think about it from the government standpoint, right? If you've got this, National Guard unit deployed to make sure that, say, people aren't bringing weapons into a certain area, I can guarantee you that just simply based on the way you dress and your body language, you will be more heavily scrutinized than someone who is completely gray, right? And obviously the 18 to 35-year-old able-bodied males probably going to be more scrutinized than other members of the family, right? So, I mean, what am I saying here? Hide your gun and your baby.
And really, if you really want to focus on this, you have to take lessons from history and look at the French resistance during World War II.
Right.
They
Oh, yeah.
they had bicycle bombs, they had bicycle messengers, they had even children that were passing messengers back and forth between um, communication outposts on both sides of German lines, and nobody paid attention to them because they were just the kid riding their bike. And it got messages passed, but it was very, very dangerous for them.
Yeah, and we can look at this in Katrina. There were some examples of this. I remember people going into the Superdome and they were all getting searched, and they were told that they were being searched to make sure they didn't have like matches and lighters. They didn't want anybody to make fire inside the Superdome. So they searched people, and then the National Guard, as soon as they were done searching them, they handed them an MRE that had matches in it.
Yep.
Right? And so what were they really looking for? Like were they actually they were likely looking for something else. They were likely looking for weapons, but they were only scrutinizing certain people. They were only searching certain people. So just don't be searchable.
Exactly. So let's talk about when martial law hits and decision trees, right? This is your second, third order effects. You realistically have three options, which are stay, move, or adapt, right? So stay is best if you already have supplies, you're low visibility, and the area is stable. Okay.
We say this all the time, like bugging in is always the best option. So if you have the ability to bug in and you aren't being forcibly relocated or something, yeah, staying is the best way, but there are ways to make yourself low vis, right? And we talked about this. You could do the FEMA markings on your own home, right? There's a lot of things you could do to make it easier to stay, making your home maybe look abandoned or those kinds of things. But yeah, you're exactly right. You have to have the supplies to do it, and you have to be in a stable area if you're going to stay.
And then there's move, which only works if you do it early. You have to move before checkpoints lock down and before fuel restrictions really set in, because otherwise you're just still pinned down in place.
Yeah, that's right, you do. You need to move early. That's what, Brad Pitt in World War Z, remember? He said movement is life, like, right when the zombies were kinda taking over the apartment building, he was trying to get the people to go with him, and he's like, "Movement is life." He said it in Spanish, I can't say it in Spanish, but anyway, yeah, that was his whole thing is you have to move because you have to do that early. If you don't move early, then you're not going to be able to move later.
Right. And then the last option is to adapt in place. And this is where you follow the rules outwardly. If you're going to resist, don't do it right in somebody's face because you're not going to have a face. 556 will destroy that. But you follow the rules outwardly and you maintain independence quietly. This is how the French
Exactly.
resistance survived.
Exactly, and what did we just notice is not on that list?
Fighting, really.
Fighting. Fighting is not on the list because statistically, that is a losing move. Just don't be that guy who thinks you're going to take on the military because they're gonna try to make you move out of your home or something. You're gonna lose. You just are.
Yeah. And now we move on to surviving under martial law. This is where people fail. They react emotionally instead of strategically. Okay. So, really, there's only three rules for this. Again, rule of three. What do
There's
you know?
always 3. There's always 3 with you.
So, rule one, compliance versus visibility. You comply where visible, you operate independently where unseen. French resistance. I'm going to keep coming back to that because it's such a good example of how well that type of machine can work. Rule two, movement discipline. Reduce unnecessary travel. The more you are out there, the more likely you are to be spotted. And then blend into patterns. Going back into Gray Man, move with the crowd. If you've ever played Assassin's Creed, how do you hide? You blend into a crowd.
Yep. Yeah.
And then
Blend in.
number three, network carefully. The French resistance worked because of small cells and compartmentalization.
Right. Yeah, not because of open rebellion, right? But they did it because they were successful because they had these small cells. They compartmentalized equipment and knowledge, and they didn't just openly fight in the streets because that was a losing battle.
Exactly. And then let's talk about escape. This is a reality check because let's be honest, most people will not escape martial law.
Yeah, and I think chasing that idea is what is going to get people caught. Because when escape works, like we said, the early phase, right? Getting out early. If you're gonna move, move early. That's when escape is gonna work. In rural areas, because there's just less population density and where you have just lower enforcement density because obviously you're going to have more enforcement where you have more people and vice versa. So that's the biggest thing. If you're rural, that's when it's probably a little easier to escape that martial law. And then when is it going to fail? Well, if it's late stage lockdown, you're not going to be able to escape. That's when it's going to be tough. Or if you're stuck in those urban centers, if you're stuck in those very high enforcement density areas, and if you have high visibility movement. So if you're moving with a large group of people, or if you're trying to, pack around your HIMARS missile or something with you, then it's just not going to work for you.
Yeah, those high Mars are not going to be terribly easy to to
Now,
hide.
maybe like inside of a giant stuffed animal or something.
Yeah, that might be too big of a stuffed animal to try to get past a checkpoint. But
Yeah.
so really the objective isn't escape, it's positioning, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, you're not going to escape, especially if it's some statewide or nationwide thing. You just need to be able to operate inside the confines of that martial law. And so, how are you going to do that? Well, if you have all of the supplies you need, again, we're preppers, we're hoarders, and I try not to encourage the hoarding, but if you have the supplies you need, then you're just not going to. You're going to choose not to participate in the martial law. If you are in a position where you can stay put and you have everything you need without going outside, without going through the checkpoints, then you're not even going to notice there's martial law because you're already prepared.
Yeah, and I think probably one of the things that we need to address that we haven't talked about yet is how important it is not to panic. Even
Sure.
if you get caught on the late side of this, if for whatever reason 3 o'clock in the morning they start to roll M1 Abrams down Main Street and you are completely caught by surprise, cut off, there is absolutely no way out of your town. Don't panic. There is still a way to survive it. There is still a way to make it through. You just have to reassess your priorities. You have to reassess your positioning and you have to reassess what you are going to do. So, that breathing exercise that we did in episode 84, then that that box breathing exercise, the 4444, it might take a few of those to completely reset, but don't panic yourself because if you panic, you're going to make bigger mistakes and you're going to get yourself in more trouble with someone who doesn't understand your complete situation and why you are doing the things that you're doing. And if they're under orders and don't understand, you're going to panic them. And panic is when mistakes get made. And unfortunately, in martial law situations, that's when the mistakes become very deadly.
That's right. Yeah, trying to stay calm, don't panic. And remembering that martial law, it really isn't chaos. It's actually the exact opposite of that. It is that controlled restriction. And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand, that when martial law is declared, it isn't just chaos in the streets. It's actually the opposite of that. It's usually to quell that chaos in the streets.
And that's what we've seen with almost every example worldwide of martial law being implemented is everything quiets down in a hurry. Um, if there are riots, they get quashed pretty quickly if the National Guard gets called in.
Yeah, it's about awareness, it's about adaptability, and it's about discipline because it really is something that you really can make it through if you're calm and if you are prepared. And ideally, if you can stay put, but if you can't stay put, if you move early. The people that make it out of these things, they usually aren't the loudest and the most dangerous or the most violent people, right?
Right. They're the ones who are still there when it's over. And that's that's something that stands on its own because history is no longer written by the victors. It's written by the ones who survive long enough to tell the tale.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, that's solid info. I think a couple that the homework assignments for this when you start talking about martial law is we've got a couple of episodes where we talked about, you know, how to find the best alternative bug out routes. That's probably one that you could go check out. And if you know the alternative bug out routes in your area, knowing those alternate routes, uh, that's definitely gonna help you out. And then any of those natural disaster episodes we've done where we've talked about what are the things I need to have on hand, what is in that FEMA 3-day kit, what's in that 72-hour kit, and extrapolate that out for those 2 or 4 weeks. I think those are things that can really help you stay prepared if this is something that you're actually worried about.
And we talked about a few episodes back about going to the grocery store and just adding one more thing to your grocery list every week. and being able to build up, 52 items into your prep list, that's more than 2 weeks right there. So
Yep.
maybe if this is something that you are concerned about, definitely we want to hear your feedback on this one. This is an important topic. It's not something that we were really expecting to address, but I'm glad we did because this is an
Yeah.
important topic.
This isn't something that was on my list of episodes I thought we would do, but it came up and I think it is an important thing to talk about. I think there are a bunch of other prepper doomcasts out there that probably have done a martial law episode and they've probably said the exact opposite of everything we just said, right? It's like, well, if you're preparing for martial law, you need more 5.56 and face paint and a don't tread on me shirt, like I think we're saying probably
Are
the
those
exact
level
opposite.
4 plates?
Are those level 4 blades? Get off my lawn. So, yeah, we're not doing that stuff because those are people that are going to be dead. I think you need to go listen to our Gray Man episode if you want to survive martial law, honestly.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. But until then, we're giving you the homework of going into our back catalog. So
Right.
you've got plenty to listen to while you're stuck in line waiting for your next checkpoint to come up. Come back next week. We're going to tackle probably one of the scariest topics that any podcast, not just prepper podcasts, but any podcasts have ever taken on. This one is bring an extra pair of underwear because if you don't need it, we haven't done our job next week. But until then, remember that you are your own stakeholder, and we will see you then.